Page 214. Each time we returned to the cell from our walk was like being arrested again. Even in our very special cell, the air seemed stifling after the outdoors, and it would have been good to have a snack afterward too. But it was best not to think about it, not at all. It was bad if one of the prisoners who received food parcels tactlessly spread out his treasures at the wrong time and began to eat. All right, we'll develop self-control. It was bad too to be betrayed by the author of the book you were reading. If he began to drool over food in the greatest detail. Getting away from me, Gogol. Get away from me, Gogol. Get away from me, Ch.5 too. They both had too much food in their books. He didn't really feel like eating, but nevertheless he ate a helping of veal and drank some beer. The son of a bitch. It was better to read spiritual things. Dostoevsky was the right kind of author for prisoners to read, yet even Dostoevsky could find that passage. The children went hungry. For several days they had seen nothing but bread and sausage. The Lubyanka library was the prison's principal ornament. True, the librarian was repulsive, a blonde spinster with a horsey build, who did everything possible to make herself ugly. Her face was so whitened that it looked like a doll's immobile mask. Her lips were purple and her plucked eyebrows were black. You might say that was her own business, but we could have enjoyed it more if she had been a charmer, perhaps. However, perhaps the chief of the Lubyanka had already taken that into consideration. But here was a wonder. Once every 10 days, when she came to take away our books, she listened to our requests for new ones. She heard us out in the same machine-like, inhuman Lubyanka manner, and it was impossible to judge whether she had heard the authors' names or the titles, whether indeed she had heard our words at all. She would leave and we would experience several hours of nervous but happy expectation. During those hours, all of the books we had returned were leafed through and checked. They were examined in case we had left pinpricks or dots underneath certain letters, for there was such a method of clandestine intramural communication, or we had underlined passages we liked with a fingernail. We were worried even though we were totally innocent. They might come to us and say, as always, they might come to us and say that they had discovered pinprick. They were always right, of course, and as always, no proof was required, and on that basis we could be deprived of books for 3 months. If indeed they didn't put the whole cell on a punishment cell regime, it would be very sad to have to do without books during the best and brightest of our prison months, before we were tossed into the pit of camp. Indeed, we were not only afraid, we actually trembled, just as we had in youth after sending a love letter, while we waited for an answer. Will it come or not, and what will it say? Then, at last, the books arrived and determined the pattern of the next 10 days. They would decide whether we would chiefly concentrate on reading, or, if they had brought us trash, be spending more time in conversation. They brought exactly as many books as there were people in the cell, this being the sort of calculation appropriate to a bread cutter, not a librarian. 1 book for 1 person, 6 books for 6 persons. The cells with the largest number of prisoners were the best off. Sometimes a spinster would fill our orders miraculously, but even when she was careless about them, things could turn out interestingly. Because the library of the big Lubyanka was unique, In all possibility, it had been assembled out of confiscated private libraries. The bibliophiles who had collected those books had already rendered up their souls to God. The main thing was that while the state security had been busy censoring and emasculating all of the libraries of the nations for decades, it forgot to dig its own bosom. Here, in its very den, one could read Samaitin, Pilniak, Panteleimon, Romanov, and any volume at all. Of the complete works of Merezhkovsky. Some people wisecracked that they allowed us to read forbidden books because they already regarded us as dead, but I myself think that the Lubyanka librarians hadn't the faintest concept of what they were giving us. They were simply lazy and ignorant. We used to read intensively during the hours before lunch, but it sometimes happened that a single phrase would get you going and drive you to pace from window to door or from door to window, and you would want to show somebody what you had read and explain what it implied, and then an argument would get started. It was a time for sharp arguments as well. I often argued with Yuri why on that March morning when they led the 5 of us into a palatial cell 53. They had just added a 6th prisoner to our group. He entered, it seemed like a spirit, and his shoes made no noise against the floor. He entered and, not sure that he could stay on his feet, leaned against the door frame. The bulb had been turned off in the cell, and the morning light was dim. However, the newcomer did not have his eyes open wide. He squinted, and he kept silent. The cloth of his military field jacket and trousers did not identify him as coming from the Soviet, or the German, or the Polish, or the English army. The structure of his face was elongated. There was very little Russian in it, and he was painfully thin, and not only very thin, but very tall. We spoke to him in Russian, and he kept silent. Susie addressed him in German. He still kept silent. Festenko tried French and English with the same result. Only gradually did a smile appear on his emaciated, yellow, half-dead face. The only such smile I had ever seen in my life. People, he uttered weakly, as if he were coming out of a faint, or as if he had been waiting all night long to be executed. And he reached out his weak, emaciated hand. It held a small bundle tied up in a rag. Our stoolie understood it instantly what was in it, threw himself on it, grabbed it, and opened it up on the table. There was half a pound of light tobacco. He had instantly managed to roll himself a cigarette 4 times the size of an ordinary one. Thus, after 3 weeks' confinement in a cellar box, Yuri Nikolaevich Lai made his appearance in our cell. From the time of the 1929 incidents on the Chinese Eastern Railroad, the song had been sung throughout the land. Its steel breast brushing aside our enemies, the 27th stands on guard. The chief of artillery of this 27th Infantry Division from back in the Civil War was the Tsarist officer Nikolai Y. I remembered the name because it was the name of one of the authors of our artillery textbook. In a heated freight car that had been converted into living quarters, always accompanied by his wife, this artillery officer had crossed and recrossed the Volga and the Urals, sometimes moving east and sometimes west. It was in this heated freight car that his son, Yuri, was born in 1917, and twin brother, therefore, of the revolution itself, spent his first years. That was a long time ago. Since then, his father had settled in Leningrad in the academy and lived well and frequented high circles, and the son graduated from the officer candidate school during the Finnish War. Yuri wanted desperately to fight for the motherland, and friends of his father got him an appointment as an aide on an army staff. Yuri did not have to crawl on his stomach to destroy the Finns' concrete artillery emplacements, nor get trapped and encircled on a scouting mission, nor freeze in the snow under sniper bullets. But his service was nevertheless rewarded, not with some ordinary decoration, but with the Order of the Red Banner, which neatly fitted on his field shirt. Thus, he completed the Finnish War in full consciousness of its justice and his own part in it. But he didn't have things so easy in the next war. The battery he commanded was surrounded near Luga. They scattered and were caught and driven off into prisoner of war camps. Yuri found himself in a concentration camp for officers near Vilnius. In every life, there is one particular event that is decisive for the entire person, for his fate, his convictions, his passions. 2 years in that camp shook Yuri up once and for all. It is impossible to catch with words or to circumvent with syllogisms what that camp was. That was a camp to die in, and whoever did not die was compelled to reach certain conclusions. Among those who could survive were the ordiners, the internal camp police or police, chosen from among the prisoners. Yes, of course, Yuri did not become an ordiner. The cooks managed to survive too. The translators could survive only. Also, they needed them, but Yuri had a superb command of conversational German. He concealed this fact. He realized that a translator would have to betray his fellow prisoners. One could also postpone dying by digging graves, but others, stronger and more dexterous, got those jobs. Yuri announced that he was an artist, and actually, as part of his varied education at home, he had been given lessons in painting. Yuri didn't paint badly in oils, and his only desire to follow in his father's footsteps, for he had been proud of his father, had kept him from entering art school. Together with an elderly artist, I regret that I don't remember his name, he occupied a separate room in the barracks, and there Yuri painted for nothing schmaltzy pictures such as Nero's Feast and the Chorus of Elves, and the like for the German officers on the commandant's staff. In return, he was given food, the slops for which the POW officers stood in line with their mess tins from 6 a.m. on, while the ordiners beat them with sticks and the cooks with ladles were not enough to sustain life. At evening, Yuri could see from the windows of their room the one and only picture for which his artistic talent had been given him, the evening mist hovering above a swampy meadow encircled by barbed wire, a multitude of bonfires, and around the bonfires beings who had once been Russian officers but now had become beast-like creatures who gnawed the bones of dead horses, who baked patties from potato rinds, who smoked manure and were all swarming with lice. Not all those two-legged creatures had died as yet. Not all of them had yet lost the capacity for intelligible speech, and one could see in the crimson reflections of the bonfires how a belated understanding was dawning on those faces which were descending to the Neanderthal. wormwood on the tongue. That life which Yuri had preserved was no longer precious to him for his own sake. He was not one of those who easily agreed to forget. No, if he was going to survive, he was obliged to draw certain conclusions. It was already clear to them that the Germans were not the heart of the matter, or at least not the Germans alone, that among the POWs of many nationalities, only the Soviets lived like this and died like this. None were worse off than the Soviets. Even the Poles, even the Yugoslavs, existed in far more tolerable conditions. And as for the English and the Norwegians, they were inundated by the internal Red Cross parcels from home. I didn't even bother to line up for the German rations. Wherever there were Allied POW camps next door, their prisoners, out of kindness, threw our men handouts over the fence, and our prisoners jumped on these gifts like a pack of dogs on a bone. The Russians were carrying the whole war on their shoulders, and this was the Russian lot? Why? Gradually explanations came in from here and there. It turned out that the USSR did not recognize as binding Russia's signature to the Hague Convention on War Prisoners. That meant that the USSR accepted no obligations at all in the treatment of war prisoners and took no steps for the protection of its own soldiers who had been captured. The USSR did not recognize the International Red Cross. The USSR did not recognize its own soldiers of the day before. It did not intend to give them any help as POWs. And the heart of Yuri, enthusiastic twin of the October Revolution, grew cold. In their barracks room, he and the elderly artist clashed and argued. It was difficult for Yuri to accept. Yuri resisted, but the old man kept peeling off layer after layer. What was it all about? Stalin? But wasn't it too much to ascribe everything to Stalin? To those stubby hands? He who draws a conclusion only halfway fails to draw it at all. What about the rest of them? The ones right next to Stalin and below him, and everywhere around the country. All those whom the motherland had authorized to speak for it. What is the right course of action if our mothers had sold us to the gypsies? No, even worse, thrown us to the dogs. She really remain our mother? If a wife had become a whore, are we really still bound to her infidelity? A motherland that betrays its soldiers, is that really a motherland? And everything turned topsy-turvy for Yuri. He used to take pride in his father, and now he cursed him. For the first time he began to consider that his father had, in essence, betrayed his oath to the army in which he had been brought up, had betrayed it in order to help establish this system, which now betrayed its own soldiers. Why then was Yuri bound by his own oath to that traitorous system? When, in the spring of 1943, recruiters from the Belarusian legions put in an appearance, some POWs signed up to escape starvation. Yuri went with them out of conviction with a clear mind, but he didn't stay in the Legion for long. As the saying goes, once they've skinned you, there's no point in grieving over the wool. By this time, Yuri had given up on hiding his excellent knowledge of German, and soon a certain chief from near Kassel, who had been assigned to create an espionage school with an accelerated wartime output, took Yuri as his right-hand man. And that was how Yuri began the downward slide he had not foreseen. That was how things got turned around. Yuri passionately desired to free his motherland, and what did they do but shove him into training spies? The Germans had their own plans. Just where could one draw the line? Which step was a fatal one? Yuri became a lieutenant in the German army, traveled through Germany in German uniform, and spent some time in Berlin, visited Russian emigres, and read authors like Bunin, Nabokov, Aldanov, Amphityatrov, whose works were forbidden at home. Yuri had anticipated that in all of their writing, in Bunin's, for example, blood flowing from Russia's living wounds would pour from every page. What was wrong with them? To what did they devote their utterly precious freedom? To the female body, to ecstasy, to sunsets, the beauty of noble brows, to anecdotes going back to dusty years? They wrote as if had been no revolution in Russia, or as if they were too complex for them to explain. They left it to young Russian people to find themselves what was highest in life. And Yuri dashed back and forth in a hurry to see, in a hurry to know, and meanwhile, in accordance with ancient Russian tradition, he kept drowning his confusion more and more often, and more deeply in vodka. What was their spy school really? It was, of course, not a real one, and they could be taught in 6 months what was to master the parachute, to use the use of explosives, and the use of portable radios. The Germans put no special trust in them. In sending them across the line, they were simply whistling in the dark. For those dying, hopelessly abandoned Russian POWs, those schools, in Yuri's opinion, were a good way out. The men ate their fill, got new warm clothing, and, in addition, had their pockets stuffed with Soviet money. Students and their teachers acted as if all this nonsense were genuine, as if they would actually carry out spying missions in the Soviet rear, blow up the designated objectives, get back in touch with the Germans via radio, and return to the German lines. But in reality, in their eyes, this school was simply a means of sidestepping death and captivity. They wanted to live, but not at the price of shooting their own compatriots at the front. The Germans sent them across the front lines, and from then on their free choice depended on their own morality and conscience. They all threw away their TNT and radio apparatus immediately. The only point on which they differed was whether to surrender to the authorities immediately, like the snub-nosed spy I had encountered at Army counterintelligence headquarters, or whether to get drunk first and have some fun squandering all that free money. None of them ever recrossed the front lines to the Germans. Suddenly, as the new year of 1945 approached, one smart fellow did return and reported he had carried out his assignment. Just go and check on it, and created a sensation. The chief hadn't the slightest doubt that Smersh had sent him back and decided to shoot him, the fate of a conscientious spy. But Yuri insisted that he be given a decoration instead, and held up as an example to the others taking the course. The returned spy invited Yuri to drink a quarter of vodka with him, and, crimson from drink, leaned across the table and disclosed, "Yuri Nikolaevich, the Soviet command promises you forgiveness if you will come over to us immediately." Yuri trembled, and that heart, which had already grown hard, which had renounced everything, was flooded with warmth. Motherland, accursed, unjust, but nonetheless still precious. Forgiveness, and he could go back to his own family and walk along the Kamenov-Trovsky in Leningrad. All right, so what? We are all Russian. If you will forgive us, we will in return, and we will behave ourselves. Oh, how well! That year and a half since he had left the POW camp had not brought Yuri happiness. He did not repent, but he could see no future either. And when, while drinking, he encountered other such unrepentant Russians, he learned that they realized clearly that they had nothing to stand on. It wasn't real life. The Germans were twisting them to suit themselves. But now, when the Germans were obviously losing the war, Yuri had been offered an out. His chief, who liked him, confided that he had a second estate in Spain which they could head for together if the German Reich went up in smoke. But there across the table sat his drunken compatriot, coaxing him at the risk of his own life. Yuri Nikolaevich, the Soviet command values your experience and knowledge. They want you to tell them about the organization of the German intelligence service. For 2 weeks, Yuri was torn by hesitation, but during the Soviet offensive beyond the Vistula, after he had led his school well out of the way, he ordered them to turn into a quiet Polish farm, lined them all up and declared, "I am going over to the Soviet side. There is a free choice for everyone." And these sad sack spies, with the milk hardly dry on their lips, who just 1 hour before had pretended loyalty to the German Reich, now cried out with enthusiasm, "Hurrah, us too!" They were shouting hurrah for their future lives at hard labor. The entire spy school hid until the arrival of the Soviet tanks, and then came Smersh. Yuri saw his boys no more. They took him off by himself and gave him 10 days to describe the whole history of the school, the programs, the sabotage assignments. He really thought they valued his experience and knowledge. They were already talking about him going home to his family. Only when he arrived at the Lubyanka did he realize that in Salamanca, he would have been closer to his native Niva. He could now await being shot, or in any case, a sentence of certainly not less than 20 years. So immutably does a human being surrender to the myth of the motherland. Just as the tooth will not stop aching until the nerve is killed, so is it with us. We shall probably not stop responding to the call of the motherland until we swallow arsenic. The lotus eaters in the Odyssey knew of a certain lotus for that purpose. In all, Yuri spent 3 weeks in our cell. I argued with him all those weeks. I said that our revolution was magnificent and just, that only the 1929 distortion was terrible. He looked at me regretfully, compressing his nervous lips. Before trying our hands at revolution, we should have exterminated the bedbugs in this country. Sometimes, oddly, he and Festenko arrived at the same conclusion, approaching them from such different beginnings. I said there had been a long period in which the people in charge of everything important in our country had been the people of unimpeachably lofty intentions and totally dedicated. He said that from the very beginning they were all cut from the same cloth as Stalin. We agreed that Stalin was a gangster. I praised Gorky to the skies. What a smart man he had been, how correct his point of view. What a great artist he was, and Yuri parried. He was an insignificant, terrible, boring personality. He invented himself, he invented his heroes, and his books were fabrications from beginning to end. Lev Tolstoy, he was the king of our literature. As a result of these daily arguments, vehement because of our youth, he and I were never able to become really close or to discern and accept each other more than we rejected. They took him out of our cell, and since then, no matter how often I have inquired, I have found no one who was imprisoned with him in the Buturki, and no one who encountered him in the transit prison. Even the rank-and-file Vlasov men have all disappeared without a trace. Under the earth, most likely. And even now, some of them do not have documents they need in order to leave the northern wastes. But even among them, the fate of Iine was not a rank-and-file fate. And we'll take a break there. Thank you for joining me. Have a good night.